Dave Johnson and Heather Coleman. We're here today on our podcast. Today's topic is unicorns and fairy dust, the myth of sole custody. And we were talking a little bit before we started the program. You get these calls all the time, right?
Oh, yeah. I think the number one thing I hear, whether it's a divorce or custody case, is, well, I want to go for sole custody. And just right off the bat, there's a lot of things wrong with that sentence.
Yeah, I mean, we both answer calls for people who call from our website looking for help. And I agree with you that it's got to be one of the most common things. And it's usually something like, I just can't take this guy anymore. I just want to fight for sole custody. And it doesn't really work that way, does it?
No, it doesn't. So Colorado has essentially done away with the term custody. It's been replaced with allocation of parental responsibilities. So what was formerly physical custody is now called parenting time, and what was formerly legal custody is now called decision making, and those both fall under allocation of parental responsibilities.
Right, and you know, getting rid of the word custody is just part of the progression in the law away from thinking about parenting time and decision making in terms of parents' rights, and thinking about it instead in terms of best interest of the child, right? Mm-hmm. Because custody basically implies I'm dragging somebody around by handcuffs and they belong to me.
Yeah.
Right. But that's not really how it works anymore, because we view all of these things from the perspective of what's best for the kids.
Mm-hmm. And Colorado has been really progressive. They're a very progressive state when it comes to allocation of parental responsibilities. And, you know, the focus is on the child. The best interest of the child drives any sort of custody determination. Which makes sole custody not really a thing anymore, because Colorado is very interested in having both parents involved in a child's life.
Yeah, I mean, that's their objective, right? Is to provide the best environment and the best arrangement for the kids, not really, I want equal time with these kids because by God, I'm the dad, mm-hmm. right? So let's talk about that. You know, when I get that phone call and somebody says, I want sole custody, I know that person really hasn't talked to anybody yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, I definitely hear that a lot. You know, I want sole custody, and that's generally when I will break it down to somebody that, you know, custody isn't really a thing. It's been replaced with this other term, and sole custody isn't really a thing, but here are some options that can maybe get you to what you think might be close to sole custody.
Right.
And, you know, that's where I start to ask somebody questions like, well, does mom or dad have an alcohol problem, substance abuse issues? Has he abandoned the child? Things like that.
Right. I mean, because really when I hear that somebody wants sole custody, I just kind of translate that in my head, that they want all the parenting time and all the decision making. And that is like hunting for Bigfoot, because it just doesn't really exist except in some really rare circumstances, right?
Yeah, very, very rare. You know, to have absolutely 100% parenting time, the other parent not even having visitation, supervised visitation, daytime visits, extremely rare.
Yeah, I mean, I could probably count on one hand the number of times I've seen that in 20, 25 years.
Yeah.
So what does tend to happen when somebody comes in and says, gee, I want to fight for sole custody, you know, what tends to happen in those types of cases? I mean, how does the court, that person wants 100% of the parenting time, wants 100% of the decision-making. How do you explain to them that they're probably not going to get that, and what should they expect?
Yeah. So, you know, the first thing I do is run through with them, you know, what parenting time in Colorado means nowadays, how the court is going to focus on best interests. And then, you know, I'll kind of start to boil down the reasons as to why they want sole custody. Is it just that you guys have disagreements as to parenting styles? Are there actual serious concerns with the other parent where they might be endangering the child?
I mean, that's a really good idea to break down what it is that they address, whatever concern it is that they have, that they're asking for sole custody. You're right. It may be that the person is violent, right? Mm-hmm. All right. So how do we address that issue rather than, all right, we just want sole custody, whatever that means, right? And so how typically does, you know, when somebody says he is just the worst father ever, and the arrangement or the environment over there is dangerous, how does the court handle that sort of circumstance? What kind of help can you give to somebody who really does feel like they should have all the parenting time because it's a dangerous situation?
I mean, there's a few things you can do in that situation. Obviously, I think getting a custody expert on board is a good idea in situations where custody is very contested because there are fears of endangerment with the other parents. And just kind of going through what the court's going to look at and things that you're really going to have to focus on to prove that your child is endangered in their care. And then from there, the first thing you're probably going to want to do is at least request supervised visits.
Right. And even when a judge has serious concerns about somebody's parenting time, a less restrictive sort of environment, not to steal from another area of law's lingo, but a less restrictive environment is the supervised parenting time instead of just cutting them off, right?
Yeah. So, when a lot of people come in saying, I want sole custody, if there would have been maybe back in the day good reasons for sole custody, those can be good reasons now for supervised visitation. And, like I said, courts still want both parents involved in the children's life, but if they maybe need to work on their parenting skills, if there are, some pretty serious concerns there, supervised visits is probably what the court's going to start them off with.
Yeah. Okay. So other legitimate concerns that this caller might have, right, would include things like substance abuse, alcohol abuse. Again, is that placing the child in danger, or is it, I guess, emotional harm, physical danger or emotional harm when you send the kid over to somebody who has an alcohol or substance problem? And a well-meaning parent might call us up and say, I just want sole custody because I don't want that child going over there anymore. How do we help that person with the substance, with a parent on the other side who has a substance or alcohol issue? Right.
And, I've dealt with this numerous times because, alcohol and substance abuse does come up a lot in a divorce or custody case. One of the biggest things that we see is that parents will get on monitored sobriety. There are devices that, you'll get an alert on your phone. It says time to blow into your device. So you're on random monitored sobriety, 2 to 4 times a day.
What's that service called? I can't remember.
SoberLink,
great.
Yeah.
SoberLink, great.
So there's this thing called SoberLink. It's often used in custody cases where there's concerns with, alcoholism, alcohol dependency. And this can be a really good tool because it's a chance for that parent to show their sobriety, to prove their sobriety. And if they have, a few months of proven sobriety, then the court will start to trust that parent more and maybe allow them to get off of supervised visits.
Okay. Any other circumstances, legitimate reasons that somebody may want in their head that they may want, quote unquote, sole custody that you can think of?
Yeah. I mean, I think alcohol and substance abuse are the biggest ones. If there are concerns of sexual abuse, that's obviously a serious concern. In unsafe environments, this happens occasionally where the other parent just doesn't have a place for them to live. Maybe they live in, basically a frat house, and it's really not a safe place for a child. Situations like that might be better suited for supervised visitation, like at a park or something like that.
So what about, sometimes we get these phone calls from somebody who says, I want sole custody because he's got a new girlfriend.
Yeah.
So what about these situations that are not legitimate concerns?
Yeah.
How do you handle those when a caller calls up and says, I want to get back at him because I want, and so I want sole custody. I want to take his kids.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can't sugarcoat things. It's best to just be upfront and just be like, look, that's not going to happen based off of what I'm hearing. And hey, it's not me. It's the court that's going to be making this decision. And in the court's eyes, dad getting a new girlfriend and maybe you don't get along with the girlfriends. That's not going to be enough.
Yeah. It's difficult to deal with those calls sometimes because you can sense the heightened emotions over something, and your job at that point, our job here in Johnson Marquez is to try and help these people, even if they're not going to hire us, to at least point them in the right direction and give them some insight about what's going on. And sometimes when we have those calls, that giving them that insight that your objective here is not going to be respected by the court. Mm-hmm. That's a difficult conversation to have with somebody.
It is. But I mean, it's what, it's what you need to hear so that you're best prepared for how your case is going to go. You don't want to have unrealistic expectations, and then you get in front of the judge and all those are blown out of the water. It's best to know what you're getting into ahead of time.
Yeah, I mean, if somebody said, "Oh yeah, that's a totally legitimate reason. You should not have to put up with the fact that dad has a new girlfriend, and let's just take those kids away." Do you really want to spend $20,000 to $50,000 going down that road and then find out in 10 minutes flat in front of the judge that this is not going to happen?
Yeah. And your time and resources would be better suited, trying to craft a parenting plan that, is really in your children's best interest and not trying to deprive them of contact with the other parent just because maybe you disagree with some of the choices they've made.
Right. So let's talk about that, the term sole custody. One of the things that again, when somebody calls us or comes in we get a lot of these, right? Calls us or comes in for a consultation. They use language that we know is incorrect, right? Yeah,
and this happens all the time. And, like I said, Colorado has done away with the term custody. It's not really used. It is allocation of parental responsibilities. So, and that's, often the first thing I have to start talking about is, get this word custody out of your head because it's not going to come up again.
I explained to him actually that it could be very harmful to use those types of terms in court because it demonstrates to the court that you aren't invested in this process. You haven't taken the time to learn what it is that's going on behind the scenes here, that this is not a custody case.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
And we see just, again, it's kind of away from the topic of unicorns and fairy dust, but we see these clients or potential clients that come in and they're using the wrong language. And again, whether they hire me or not, I try and get them to focus on using the language that all the professionals are going to use. And one of those things is talking about custody in terms of time and decision making.
Yeah,
parenting time, decision making.
And if you decide not to hire an attorney, you want to show the judge that you've done your research, that you're prepared, that you're using the correct terminology. Like Dave said, they're gonna if they hear the word custody, they might correct you.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, it tips the judge off. Another one of those things that I tell judges or clients and potential clients to avoid is saying "my kids." These are not just my kids. And when you say that, you're letting the judge peek into your mental state and your objective. And if your objective is to wall off the other parent and you don't have a really darn good reason for doing it, then the judge is not going to be very happy with you, right?
Yeah, and if you focus on yourself instead of talking about the kids, you want to talk about the kids the whole time. You don't want to focus on yourself. You don't want to focus on your dislike for your ex-spouse. You want to make it all about the kids.
Right. And you have to, one of the most important things I tell clients is that when the court is deciding parenting time responsibilities and decision-making responsibilities, it oftentimes asks itself, can this parent facilitate the relationship between the child and the other parent? Right? Why is that?
That's one of the factors that the court has to look at is, whether the parties are able to, share mutual support, time commitment, whether they're able to encourage a relationship between the other parents and the child. And if you're not able to do that, that's strike one against you.
Yeah, but why is that? What is the positive side of being able to develop the relationship between the other parent and the child?
It shows that you're putting your children's interests ahead of your own. You may have your disagreements with your ex-spouse, and that's why you guys have separated, but the focus is still your children and making sure they grow up, with both parents in happy, healthy environments. And if you focus on, belittling the other parents, that's not going to be good for your kid. Because
that kid's parent is that other person, right? And there's nothing that kid can do to change that. That is going to be their parent for the rest of their life. And that relationship is really important to the child, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and I think when we are confronted with a divorce or confronted with the threats that come from filing an allocation case, and you feel threatened because you feel like the other person is going to take your kids away, oftentimes you become very self-centered. You very much focus on your needs and the threats that you're perceiving. And I think a good lawyer is going to help the client get out of that perfectly legitimate mind state and recognize that they really do have to shift and focus on the benefit and the best interest of the child, right?
Yeah, and a good lawyer all lawyers have an ethical obligation to guide parents in the right direction when they're in the middle of a very heated custody battle. If it becomes clear that the parent is focusing more on themselves and doing things that could even possibly end up hurting the child, a lawyer has to advise them that, hey, the focus is your child. You need to stay focused on the child.
Okay. Any other thoughts on the topic of clients seeking sole custody?
It's funny because it not really funny, but strange. I mean, it is maybe the number one thing I hear is that, well, I just want to go for sole custody. And, before you walk in and say that, you should really think about, why you want sole custody. And if it seems like, me and dad just don't really get along. But if your children do get along with their dad, then, I mean, maybe sole custody isn't what's best for them.
Yeah, it's tough because these parents, they're newcomers to this entire field, right? The idea of splitting parenting time and decision making never crossed their minds once. Mm-hmm. So they make these colossal mistakes and assumptions, and they're basically starting from ground zero. So it's hard to judge their motives and their objectives too harshly, because they don't know it as well as we do, I try and when somebody comes in and asks for sole custody, I try and put myself in their shoes and see how I would be responding right now if I knew nothing about family law.
Yeah.
Because it is this process can be jarring and threatening, and you want to do the best thing for your kids. So anything else on that sole custody?
I think it's been covered pretty well. I guess my advice would be to, really do your research and, always put your children's interests first and foremost.
Yep, that's good advice. All right, so that is our podcast for today, Unicorns and Fairy Dust, the myth of sole custody. We'll see you next week.